Hello, and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. Happy New Year from us. For our first episode back, we're looking ahead to the potential flashpoints of 2025, and we're asking the simple question, where in the world should we be watching? There is a lot to look at. A long list of ongoing conflicts, from Russia's assault on Ukraine to the Israel-Hamas war and the devastating civil war in Sudan. There are also places where tensions are high, and the list here is long as well. Russia's hostility against NATO in the Baltic and Black Sea, US-China antagonism in Asia-Pacific, and that's before we factor in Donald Trump's recent comments about acquiring Greenland and the Panama Canal. So what are the main dangers? What are the consequences for the world if relations cannot be stabilized? And I might try and get us to a bit of optimism at the end of this conversation about what positive things we might also look forward to. But to discuss all this, I have a fantastic set of guests, all of whom are returning voices. Hello first to Leslie Vinjamuri, the director of our US and Americas program. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Great to have you here. Hello too to Gideon Rachman, chief foreign affairs commentator for the Financial Times. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Very good to have you. Also with us in the studio is Renad Mansour, Senior Research Fellow with our Middle East and North Africa program. Hello.
Hi, Brian.
Great to see you. Well, Gideon, let me start with you. Where are you looking ahead in the year? What are you most concerned about?
Well, to be honest, it's very hard to look further ahead than a few weeks at the moment. I mean, I know obviously it's my job to try and look much further ahead, but the blizzard of news is really pretty intense and seems to be getting more intense with Trump's approach to the White House. He's acting already as a kind of president, making policy of a most startling nature, wanting to incorporate Greenland into the United States, reclaim the Panama Canal.
Do you take those as jokes or things he's trying out? Yeah.
I absolutely don't think they're jokes. I think that, one of Trump's mechanisms is to make a joke which is actually serious. Whether he'll achieve these things are a completely different story. But I think he's in earnest about it. I think he's, I'm afraid, a bit of a megalomaniac. I think he'd like to see the United States grow in almost like a real estate purchase. And I also don't think he's joking about wanting to turn Canada into the 51st state. Again, it's delusional. It's not going to happen. But it's incredibly disruptive to the Western alliance. So all the other issues that you raise, US-China relations, US-European relations, the Middle East, if Trump's opening act is one of sort of destruction towards the Western alliance, which has been a kind of bedrock in dealing with all of these issues and has worked together over decades before and after the Cold War, if Trump's opening gambit is to disrupt the Western alliance, then everything else is thrown into confusion, I think.
And it isn't just disrupting the alliance, saying things that are very awkward for heads of government of his allies, is it? It's saying the US thinks it might acquire many other countries. This is expansionist.
Of course,
I'm not going to call it a flight of fancy because I think you're quite right. It is trying something on, but it is an expansionist vision which he is putting out there, which does not say much about respecting countries' borders, histories, the rest of it.
Not at all. And it's absolutely manna from heaven for Putin and for Xi Jinping, because, how does the West or the US continue to make the argument that it would be wrong for China to invade Taiwan, citing strategic and historic reasons, if the US is threatening to do the same with Greenland, even if it's not a serious threat, although we'll see.
And the same with Ukraine.
Yeah, and the same with Ukraine, exactly. And, the question is, does Trump has he thought this through? Does he care? I suspect he doesn't much care, because he has made it clear that in a sense he's not really that interested in the fate of Ukraine. And he's also, from what we know in the background, said, the US is not going to fight over Taiwan. Joe Biden said 4 times that America would go to war over Taiwan, whether you think that's a wise pledge or not. He did say it. Trump has very notably not said that. And I think that maybe he is groping towards a kind of great power carve-up of the world in which China gets more of its sway in East Asia, although a lot of the people around him, and we'll get onto this, would be horrified by that. But I think maybe in Trump's mind, a sort of regional spheres of influence thing wouldn't be so bad if America got more to dominate Panama, Mexico, Canada, Greenland, Russia, more of Eastern Europe, China, more of its region.
Leslie, how do you see it?
It is very interesting to watch President-elect Donald Trump pushing on Canada and Greenland in particular. And I can't help but think where he's drawing our attention to the Arctic. We know how important the sea lanes are, increasingly so. We know that this is a place for geopolitical competition. So what's he trying to do? He's clearly trying to move the boundaries of what we consider to be acceptable. He won't get to where he started, but he'll get somewhere. We're thinking about these questions, Canada. But, is he also trying to say to Canada and to Greenland, wake up because there's something, and he hasn't articulated this, so we're sort of reading beyond his words, but is he also trying to say, wake up because there's something really important going on in the North, and if you don't do something, we will. The question is why he doesn't try to do it through diplomacy, through partnerships, through asking for concrete things. He's not doing it. On Taiwan, I don't think I'm very skeptical. I mean, I'm very curious, but skeptical that even Donald Trump wants to see America's capacity to influence and keep the sea lanes open in the Indo-Pacific. I don't think he wants to give that up. I don't think, therefore, he's really about spheres of influence
But
or that kind
that's
of ground
different
bargain.
from not going to war over Taiwan.
Well, but
It's essentially saying to China, look, you can have it.
Well, it depends on your theory, right? If you go to his nominee for Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Bridge Colby, he's made it very clear, including here at Chatham House, that Taiwan is not just Taiwan. It's the gateway to controlling the Indo-Pacific. If you give up Taiwan, that is the beginning, not the end of something, which is why Taiwan is, for Bridge, who he's appointed, right? And, that must tell us something. And I know that Gideon has something to say about that. That must tell us something, right?
I think Bridge is actually adapting his position. I mean, I saw him
Well,
at the Republican convention just after Trump had made comments suggesting that he was not really that interested in defending Taiwan. And I'm not betraying confidence because Bridge has now changed his position on Twitter. Amazingly, this is where these things are communicated, and said, well, maybe, if Taiwan doesn't spend more to defend itself, we're just going to have to give up on Taiwan and fall back.
yeah, but is that a provocation or is that a policy change, right? Because the whole style is you better do this or we're going to take you over Canada. We're going to take you over Greenland. We're going to take you over Panama. Or is it a provocation to push Europe, to push different parts of the world,
Including
that are
South
vital,
Korea
to do more, right?
and Japan, where Trump and the people around him have said, look, pay
Yeah.
up. I don't know, again, I think it's a very good point to raise. It's just very hard, it seems to me, to interpret whether it is just this demand for more money from allies or whether it is something more strategic.
Does Trump even know? I mean, I think that what you see in the likes of the Bridge Colbys is a sort of desperate effort to keep up with the boss's thinking and then to kind of rationalize it subsequently when he says something about Greenland or Taiwan, and then people like us, because we're used to thinking in these kind of rational terms, say, oh well, maybe he's actually thinking about the balance of power in the Arctic. Well, maybe, or maybe he's just crazy
Or chaotic. Before we swing around to the Middle East, and I'm about to come to Renad on a whole host of things, but let me just ask the two of you what you think Trump and the people around him, a very important point you've made, are likely to do about Ukraine, because this decision is coming down the line very fast.
There are a million proposals out there, and we obviously don't know. That's the number one thing to say. We do not know whether he is going to follow the line, which is double down on support for Ukraine in order to pressure Russia to negotiate and get a better deal.
And there's a lot of analysis around at the moment about just how weak Putin might be, as Syria showed, and this kind of thing,
Exactly.
or whether he's going to do a deal.
And the question is, what does he do when he doesn't get what he wants from Putin? That's, because that seems highly likely, more likely than the alternative that Putin sort of, plays ball. And all bets are off. I mean, I guess if I had to guess, I think that Trump might revert to the mean when he doesn't get what he wants. I don't think he's going to want to be seen to be the leader of the Western world that fails when it comes to Ukraine. I think he will quickly see the broader implication. And I think, much like we saw in his first term in office, he said he was going to get out of the Middle East. He didn't get out of the Middle East. So I don't think it's going to be the same, but I think that he will not want to be the one who fails.
The Ukrainians, insofar as they have a sort of strategy for dealing with what Trump may throw at them, I think are hoping that something like what Leslie outlines happens, that Trump says to Putin, okay, here's a deal, and Putin doesn't take it because actually his goals are very maximalist. And at that point, the Americans and Trump in particular lose patience with Putin and may even increase support for Ukraine. I mean, I'm not saying that's going to be how it works out, but that is what the Ukrainians are hoping. But I think that Trump will also want to avoid a kind of Kabul-style debacle on his watch. It would look very bad if Ukraine collapses, if Russian tanks finally make it to Kiev. So to some extent, there is an incentive in trying to prop Ukraine up. But I don't think Trump has much interest in the details of a peace deal. He just wants to say, that we've settled that one and taken it off the table. But whether that's possible, I somehow doubt.
Well, we'll have to see, and perhaps not for very long. Let me come round now to the Middle East, because last year, it's not an artificial break, but last year ended with this extraordinary series of events, including the fall of Assad. We still do not have any kind of peace deal in Gaza. Renad, what are you looking at right now?
Well, I think, we've been discussing these global transformations, and the Middle East is a front line of how the world is changing, a very violent front line of shifts in the global order. And you see these pockets of violence across the region. The big story at the end of last year. And by the way, last year was a very humbling year for analysts, I think. A lot of sort of assumptions that people had, a lot of ideas were just broken because people can change things and things can change. And I think Syria is the big story on that.
And it was, if you like, non-state actors, in the jargon, HTS group coming from nowhere that overthrew
Exactly.
the regime.
But the fact that a 50-plus regime could just crumble and implode in just over a week was, no analyst had predicted that. So, it takes us the time to step back and think, okay, well, 2025, the year ahead, how do we pick up the pieces? How is this puzzle going to be rearranged in Syria, but also across the region where you have conflicts in Israel, Palestine, Iran, of course.
Iran feels like one of the big questions. It's hanging there, and as Iranian leadership must be thinking, what happens to them this year?
That's right. 2024 was not a good year for Iran. 2025 will be a year of adaptation for Iran. It's having to rethink its defense doctrine. It's having to rethink the way it goes about its networked approach with non-state actors and state actors. But it's also, part of the research that we've been doing at Chatham House, including with the ACCEPT program, the cross-border conflict evidence policy trends funded by the UK development, is looking at supply chains and the ways in which Iran is reaching out to alternative economies and alternative actors, trying to overcome the kind of the sanctions that's imposed on it, the losses that it's had, but also the changing world structure. So if you look at fuel supply chains, Iran has actually increased its exports of fuel post maximum pressure. It has very strong relations with China, with Russia. And so there is an alternative economy emerging where Iran is trying to look through as a new approach, as an adaptation to some of the losses last year. So that's where I would look to. And the big trump card will be the U.S. president coming in, Donald Trump, because we know that while there is discussions from his transition team on settlements in Ukraine and Russia, settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict, there isn't discussions on settlement on Iran. In fact, many people in his team, including the neoconservatives, continue to have a hardline policy on Iran. So Iran has its back against the wall moving into 2025, but it's thinking strategically. It's thinking, how do we adapt? How do we reassert some kind of resilience, rethink the way we do politics, reaching out to the Gulf, reaching out to others in a way to try and overcome certainly what was a bad year from Iran, the Iranian government's perspective.
What happens to Iran's nuclear program now?
Well, that's one of the questions. As it rethinks its defense doctrine, as it realizes that this post-October 7th Middle East is a completely different Middle East. The balance of power has changed, and Iran needs some kind of bargaining tool. And the nuclear program, of course, has been something, whether the threat of having a nuclear program or actually getting it is certainly one of the sort of discussions that the Iranian elite are having right now as to how to protect their country from these antagonisms. It's hard to say whether they do get to having a nuclear sort of weapon, a nuclear bomb, but nonetheless, it is something being discussed by the inner circles of the elites in Tehran.
And what do you see about Israel, Gaza itself? The Trump team seems interested in the Saudi deal, the normalization with Israel that is perpetually hanging there, but of course now conditional on something substantial for the Palestinians, which Israel and the Trump administration don't seem very inclined to give.
Yeah, this is an interesting point that Saudi Arabia has continued to stand on its sort of red line that there needs to be a Palestinian state, there needs to be a resolution to the Israel-Palestine conflict before there can be normalization with Israel. I think that certainly, the Trump administration has said that it sees the need for a settlement, and they want to be the ones to bring in that settlement so that they could broker peace, as it were. And Saudi Arabia and many countries, Arab countries in the region have made it clear that whatever the settlement is, there needs to be a state for Palestinians. And they continue to stand on that. So the question becomes the extent to which the Trump administration...
Possibly out of their own self-protection,
Of course.
their
course.
reputation
I mean,
in the Muslim world.
But also their populations.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
people across the Middle East have seen what's happened. They've seen what's happened in Gaza and also the West Bank. And it's hard for these regimes to control or to govern their people when siding with Israel at the moment. So certainly it's also out of self-preservation.
Gideon, do you see any movement on that? I mean, we know that Trump had great hopes of declaring, as Reagan was able to on his first day, sort of bringing hostages out, ending conflicts. And there have been a lot of talks going on at the Trump team, Ukraine and Israel. But do you see them doing anything quickly on Israel-Gaza?
Well, I mean, I think that the Trump people, as you suggest, would love to be able to have a hostage release and say, this was something that Trump could achieve that the Biden team couldn't. And I'm sure the Netanyahu people would prefer that happened under Trump than under Biden. They get on much better with Trump than with the Biden people. So it's possible that they'll wait and do the deal only when Trump is in power. That said, there's also a domestic Israeli political angle. I mean, it's a very difficult subject, a contentious subject within Netanyahu's very unstable coalition. The hostage families are one force, the extreme right elements of his own government are another. They're all in opposition. And I think, like all politicians, Netanyahu's first thought will be his domestic political situation, particularly given the fact that he's on trial at the moment for corruption. So, without being on the inside of those negotiations, it's very, very hard to tell how close we are to resolving this tragedy. And then beyond that, the Israelis, as far as I can see, have not got at least an openly stated plausible view of what happens to Gaza afterwards. It looks like they're trying to clear a new zone, a sort of security zone in the north of Gaza so that their own territory is less vulnerable, whatever happens inside. But then what happens there? Who polices it? Do the settlers who want to resettle that area get their way? I doubt it, because it would create a fresh security problem.
But the settlers are getting a lot of their way at the moment.
They are indeed, yeah. And the West Bank we've only touched on, but that's a whole separate issue. And I think that one of the reasons that the Israelis and the Netanyahu government are looking forward to Trump is that the Biden administration, although he didn't do that much to kind of rein in Israel, would not have accepted formal annexations. I think Trump might.
Including of the West Bank.
Yeah, bits of it, chunks of it. I don't think in its entirety. But the only break on that is that I think Trump does also value the Saudi relationship. And also the Israelis may, if they see a prospect of this long-awaited rapprochement with Saudi Arabia, see, trade off the ambition for settlements or annexations. But certainly, I mean, the Biden people, when I last spoke to them, were quite worried that this would be something that Trump would do, that he would give the Israelis the green light for annexation.
It would be such a tragedy if the Trump administration fails to learn what seems to be one of the key lessons of October 7th, which is don't pretend like the Palestinian question is just going to go away. And it is very unclear what concretely the Trump administration is thinking about, or if they are thinking about a realistic two-state solution or something else. And to Gideon's point, obviously that's going to be important with Saudi Arabia. I found myself, as an aside, thinking, where will Donald Trump's first trip be? It was, as we recall, Saudi Arabia, right? An extraordinary visit in his first administration. In this new context, it's a little bit harder to imagine. But yeah, again, I think it's hard to see where the deal is. But let's hope that it is something that has staying power, and given the rhetoric that's come out of the Trump team, it's so far hard to see that.
All right, so we're not getting a lot of support here for the idea that Trump might successfully resolve some of these these conflicts. We've been talking mainly about Ukraine and Israel-Gaza. I wanted just to swing to Sudan for a moment, which we spend at Chatham House quite a bit of time on and in all kinds of ways wish the world would spend more. But many countries, Renad, are now involved there on either side. And it is getting worse and worse. You've now got the UAE on one side, Iran on the other side, Libya, Egypt, Russia. What is your view of what may happen there this year?
I mean, the tragedy of what's happened in Sudan is a sort of domestic uprising. People calling for reforms led to a sort of civil war, which has...
Initially, at its simplest,
Yes.
a clash between two men.
Exactly. It's not even a civil war anymore. It's a transnational conflict. As you say, there are so many external powers and players in gaining influence there. Part of it is economic. The supply chains of gold is so important, and they end up in the UAE. So there's financial reasons for this. Also,
Sudan gold brokers always were in Dubai, but now going in to get the gold that the Wagner Group used to be getting.
Exactly. But also geostrategic. Sudan is really important in sort of Africa and the kind of link between Africa to the Middle East. So there's sort of economic and geostrategic reasons why all of these countries from far away are fighting over this land and either one side of these two men, as you say. And the result is a tragedy. The result is, it's not picked up as much in the media, but you have devastation, famine.
Between 11 and 15 million people displaced.
That's right. It's just a tragedy. And again, no end in sight. And, coming into this year, it's hard to see really a resolution. Because how do you resolve a war when it's not just the national partners that you need to get in to come to a resolution, but everyone else? You need a sort of transnational deal to solve what is a local conflict.
And it is something that Britain and the US have been involved in down the years. So let's all perhaps take a step back. We've been talking about all these conflicts. We've been inevitably talking quite a Trump-flavoured conversation, if only to home in on the unpredictability of what he and his team might do. But are we heading for a much more disordered world, or are we heading for one where the US will have one zone of influence, China have another, and the rules of the world will sort of get sorted out between them? Gideon, you've been writing a bit about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be a bit of both. that a sort of...
I'm a particular interest in that I'm writing about this in my director's lecture next week. So I'm really interested in the answers from the three of you.
So even if it was an effort at spheres of influence, I don't think that's necessarily a stable solution, because how do you define those spheres of influence? Where does ambition stop? And at what point do the Americans, for example, say, well, we may have signed off on Russia up to this point, but you've taken it further than we wanted? Or at what point are there unpredictable consequences of leaving a security vacuum, for example, in Europe? And it was interesting, when I was in the US talking to some of what I'd call kind of neo-isolationists, I think they'd call themselves restrainers around Trump. And I was sort of saying, look, the whole America First slogan was a slogan from the 1930s and the early 20th century, but that in both the First and Second World Wars, America attempted to stay out and ended up being dragged in. And one of the people I was speaking to said, yeah, but we should never have got involved in the First World War. That was not our fight. It was a really interesting insight into a sort of return of an ideology I think we'd sort of forgotten about, but a sign also of how a lot of the sort of governing assumptions of American foreign policy are now fading away. But I don't think that the transition to a new order would be stable or predictable.
Leslie, how do you see it? Do you see the US as retreating from a role in the world? And there was a lot of this talk during the Biden administration. I'm thinking now that Biden is almost in the rearview mirror. Actually, his exit from Afghanistan and various other things he said did contribute to this sense that America pulling back. On the other hand, while we've got Trump saying no new wars on my watch, I'm very proud of that in my first term, and pay up everyone if you want America's support, some of the other things that we have been discussing, including Greenland, let's just take that as a symbol, these are not America retreating from a role in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I've never agreed with the line that Donald Trump is isolationist or neo-isolationist. I don't think that the American the restrainers, a very important line of thinking in the policy world and the academic world. I don't think that they're dominant, nor will they be. It's one thing to say that Donald Trump doesn't believe in the liberal international order. He doesn't necessarily believe in the rules-based order. that doesn't mean that he's an isolationist, right? There's a lot of other paths
I think
to
that's a good
be
way of putting it.
very hard power oriented, very engaged. Sure, he doesn't want to have America's boots on the ground, but he's certainly going to use economic coercion. He's certainly going to use his version of diplomacy. He certainly has ambitions in Asia. He has ambitions with respect to what Europe should do. He's not saying it's up to you. He's scripting some of it, right? And I do think that those economic tools will be very important. On the spheres of influence question, I think it's kind of the wrong way to think about things. I think there are clearly going to be partnerships and alliances that are at odds with each other, but I don't think they're going to be geographically defined because spheres of influence, if you think just about the Indo-Pacific, that requires much of ASEAN to what they want right now is strategic autonomy, not to be under China's rule. Japan, South Korea, Australia, you've just got major parts of the world that would have to concede, and I don't see it happening. They may understand that there's going to be more pressure to step up and provide for their own security and defense. But to concede to spheres of influence, there are just simply too many people, too many countries for that to eventually produce anything that's stable. And getting there, getting from where we are now to a world that's divided up in that way will be bloody and treacherous and deeply problematic. So I think it's, useful as an analytical tool to bounce our ideas off of it. But I think it's just very unrealistic, actually.
In the Middle East, do you feel that, Renad, that US and China are shaping what's happening, or really is the region now doing that for itself?
I agree with Leslie's point. We may be moving to something that could be a spheres of influence, but we're in that transition period, which is why it's so violent, which is why it's so chaotic. I think this year what we'll see is more of these types of like a networked world order, where each country could be, with one sphere on one issue and another sphere on another issue, with America on one issue, with China on another issue. Countries are multi-aligned across the Middle East, and they're networked. And even with Iran, for example, we know that Gulf countries may have a political stance against it, but economically they do work with them. So it's a networked world where we're moving
It's a
towards.
really interesting
and
way
it's
of putting
chaotic,
it.
And it's chaotic.
Yeah, there was one Middle East ambassador said to me just before the end of the year, it's like the Cold War in that everyone lines up on one side or the other, except it's not like the Cold War.
Exactly.
It's different.
Exactly.
It's different countries on every possible
And there's no
subject.
us and them. There's no good guys, bad guys, evil versus good. This is all out. It's networked and it's transactional and it's issue based.
Mm.
And so, Gideon, if you look at things like UN Security Council now jammed by various vetoes, but with quite a powerful demand from global South countries for more of a voice there, more of a call by global South countries, if I can use that term, for representation in the world's institutions. Do you see that happening and having any steadying effect, or are those old bits of the architecture of global governance really of the past?
Yeah, I don't see Security Council reform happening really for all the reasons we're familiar with. Everybody kind of agrees in principle that it's a good idea, even Britain, which stands to lose influence from it. But getting agreement on the mechanism and who joins and so on is just too difficult. And I think will continue to be too difficult. I think generally the UN is losing influence, losing sway in this new, more realpolitik-driven world in which the global rules-based order is kind of falling into abeyance. So I think that the thing to watch as a possible new vector of influence would be the BRICS, which is expanding its membership. I saw Indonesia joined this week. It's yet to prove that it's more than a kind of convening club of non-Western countries, that it can work together, for example, in the way that G7 has in, say, imposing sanctions or actually agreeing on policies. But it's certainly something that's moving. And I think it's underlying thought that here's a group of countries that, whatever their other differences, want alternatives to West-dominated, US-dominated world. That group is growing, and I think will continue to grow given the way in which Trump is behaving.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting, the BRICS are obviously very complicated, lots of powerful emerging countries with very different
As
interests.
Gideon says, at the moment it's sort of a club that's cool to join
Yeah.
for a certain kind of country and for the Secretary General of the UN to visit. But
But what
But
is
what
it?
does it
And
do?
also remember that some countries are in there to make sure it doesn't do too much, and that would be India. So, I mean, I think that the real game is not going to be on these larger formal institutions. They're important. They're places to convene and talk and, watch out for your interests, and that includes the UN Security Council. But it's really the mini laterals, right? It's this Biden's ambition, as we know, which he realized in many, whether it's the Quad or very nascent Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, AUKUS, number of things. There are these smaller, relatively formal but not fixed organizations where I think there is a degree of cooperation, and they're not only Western. I point to some of the Western ones. That I think is where a lot of the attempts to order, to create norms, to create rules will be meaningful and take place rather than these larger multilaterals, which we know are stuck. This is not about Trump or Biden. This has been going on for a very long time, and they're not going to go away. But we understand the very deep limitations and getting deeper.
So I said at the beginning, I would ask you for a note of positivity or what you might be looking forward to this year or hoping for this year. Renad, let me start with you.
I guess picking up from last year, what happened in Syria, we have concern of where it could go, but at the moment, people are returning home for the first time in many years. Families are reuniting. It was a popular uprising across the country that was HTS led, but driven by all sorts of different parts of Syria. This is a critical period for Syrians and for the Middle East. And so hopefully we've been hearing some positive messaging from Jolani and the sort of interim government in Syria. The hope would be that positive messaging continues and there's actions to some of the words. He's looking towards developing a country that's cross-sectarian, that's not necessarily a dictatorship again. That's perhaps one glimpse of potential positivity.
Yeah, I guess, today, I know this will probably be posted tomorrow, but today is Jimmy Carter's funeral. And I would say, to me, his legacy is most remarkable for his many years working to try to bring peace to some very tough places, to work on global health issues post-presidency. And I think that, as I look ahead, we clearly have a number of leaders that are, very able and some that we see as very problematic. And what we need to do is to look beyond only heads of state. Certainly in the U.S., the need for, leaders across all of society as well as the many states is going to be important. It's going to be challenged. But I also think it's going to be some of where we're going to be looking to for hope. So, Carter's post-president's legacy, working as a leader, but not a head of state, looking to, again, California's governor, to presidents of universities, to hopefully many leaders in the private sector that try to stick to a set of principles and norms as they do their work that, brings up the fabric of some of the things that we've sought to achieve, obviously with, limited success, but some real success over the last 7 or 8 decades.
Gideon.
Well, I mean, I think the possibility of a peace deal in Ukraine is some sort of hope. I mean, obviously, we all have our reservations about how it's brought about and whether it would be durable. But if the fighting actually stopped, this is a conflict that's caused 1 million casualties, all told, killed and wounded. Well, that would be great if we could find a way of stopping it one way or another. And I think in the political front, a possible new direction for Germany. I mean, the Scholz government has been pretty uninspiring and is coming to a close. If Friedrich Merz can win reasonably clearly and turns out to be a good chancellor, that's good for Germany and it's good for Europe at a time when Europe badly needs some leadership.
Those are all, I find myself immensely cheered up by those 3 points. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to have to stop there. Thank you enormously, Gideon Rachman, Leslie Vinjamuri, Renad, Mansour. Do follow them all on X and Blue Sky, where you can also find Chatham House. All the details are in the show notes as usual. And I'll be talking more about these kind of questions, particularly about relations between the US and China, at my director's lecture on the 14th of January. That's next week. And I'll look at the question of global governance and how that might be changing and what that means for international order or lack of it. For details, do look at chathamhouse.org as well. And you can find all the episodes of Independent Thinking on Apple, Spotify, all major platforms, as well as through our social media. So please do follow us and tell your friends. For now, what I think is going to be a very busy year, that's it from me, Bronwen Maddox. See you next week.